You're learning about how to use inflation to make you wealthier while it only makes most people poorer. Hi, I'm Keith Weinhold. This is Get Rich Education. Welcome back to video number 2 in this 3-part Inflation Triple Crown series, where we kind of uncover these little understood ways that real estate investors get wealthy over time. A type of series that I don't think you're going to find anywhere else. In the first video, we talked about the first crown of the Inflation Triple Crown, which is price inflation. The second one is what we're talking about today, debt debasement. And then the third one in the next video will be about cash flow enhancement. Look, inflation could mean 4 times as much to you as it does the average person. So that's why this really matters. And why could it matter 4 times as much to you as another, say, mutual fund investor in their 401k? Well, that person, say they have $250K worth of mutual funds. Well, then they only have $250K worth of mutual funds. But if you have $250K in a down payment or as equity in an apartment, you may very well have a $1 million apartment building or $1 million portfolio, and you have inflation acting on that entire $1 million, not just the $250K like the mutual fund investor does. You have that force of inflation working on a greater amount. That's why in this example, it could be 4 times more important. Now, to use another example to talk about this second of 3 crowns of the Inflation Triple Crown called debt debasement is just say that you have, to use another round number, $1 million of debt total on your real estate. And if you're a beginner and that sounds like a lot, hey, just think of it as 100K in debt. It all involves ratios, so it all scales. If we have a 4% inflation rate over time, with the $1 million that you've borrowed from the bank, look, the bank doesn't ask to be paid back in inflation-adjusted dollars, only nominal dollars. Remember from the last video, nominal means in name only. So you can pay them back in inflated dollars, dollars that have their purchasing power diluted over time. So therefore, at a 4% inflation rate, if you have $1 million of debt, you only owe the bank back $960K in inflation-adjusted dollars after year 1, and $920 after year 2, and $880 after year 3, and so on, because the bank does not ask to be paid back in inflation-adjusted dollars. And, some people pause that are new to real estate and say, well, wait, what about the interest payments on that $1 million you borrowed? Well, no, you might remember from the last video, the only way you borrow that $1 million is if it goes into a property where the monthly rent income meets or exceeds all of the monthly property expenses, including the mortgage. Therefore, your principal payment, interest payment, and a little on top of that called cash flow is all outsourced to the tenant as long as you buy right. That's why we talk about buying right here at Get Rich Education so often. So look, this is a $40,000 annual benefit to you. A $40K phantom benefit, an increase in your net worth that most real estate investors don't even understand. That's the impact of this debt debasement. I myself have millions of dollars in real estate debt tied up in cash flowing properties just this way. On my podcast, the Get Rich Education podcast, I did one episode called the Debt Decamillionaire. A decamillionaire means someone with a net worth of $10 million. This is a debt decamillionaire. If you have $10 million in debt at a 4% inflation rate, yeah, you've got $400K of this inflation profiting benefit through debt debasement. Let's talk about how to measure inflation, because when you're leveraged with loans this way, you might be an inflation cheerleader, much like me. I cheer for inflation in a sense. I'm like, go, 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 because it's good for my net worth when I've structured things this way. Some might think, well, to measure inflation, just take a basket, like maybe even a shopping cart full of goods, and then just track the price of that over time. So it ought to be pretty easy to measure inflation. No, it's not. Measuring inflation is difficult to impossible. And everyone pays a different rate of inflation. You and I pay a different rate of inflation. Beef price inflation does not affect vegetarians. Inflation in the cost of car gasoline, that affects a long-haul commuter substantially more than it does a stay-at-home internet marketer, for example. You and your spouse even pay different rates of inflation in the same household. It can be difficult to track things over time because, for example, computers and iPhones have so many more features than they did just 10 years ago. The price is down, and yet the benefit is up. So economists try to make what they call hedonic adjustments. Are you entitled to progress and speed and convenience? What if the next iPhone is faster than the current one, yet they both cost the same? So this is another example of a hedonic adjustment. Now, what if your car actually costs the same as it did last year, but now interest rates are lower, so you can refinance and maybe pay a lower monthly amount in principal and interest? How do you factor that into inflation? And then there are these one-off shocks that introduce these aberrations into the market, like recent shortages we've had for lumber and copper and semiconductor chips and all sorts of things. So inflation numbers, they're usually reported year over year. So let's look at 4 different measures of inflation. None of them are anywhere near perfect, but it's what we got. The most cited one is the CPI, or even the CPI-U. That stands for the Consumer Price Index. Sometimes you'll see the -U there on the end for urban consumers is what that means. And the CPI measures the price change for a basket of goods and services paid by urban consumers. It's the one you most often see quoted in the media, but the CPI excludes investment assets like real estate and stocks. It also strips out much of the food and energy components because they're the most volatile. At least that's why the government says that they want to strip those things out. But I mean, come on. Everyone needs food and energy in order to live. You can always check the CPI. It's reported monthly. Again, it's reflected as a year-over-year stat at bls.gov/CPI. Let's look at the second of 4 measures, the core PCE. That means personal consumption expenditures. It's really similar to the CPI. Core CPE is chiefly what the Fed uses, though, when they make their policy decisions. If they see inflation going up, they'll raise interest rates. Interest rates and inflation are positively correlated. The third one is the PPI, the Producer Price Index. This is a really interesting one. This is not about consumers. The PPI is how much it costs producers to make stuff. And see, because items are produced before they're consumed, the PPI can be a bellwether indicator to higher inflation. And the PPI recently checked in at 6.2%. Quite high, could be indicative that more inflation is coming. Those first 3 were all government measures. Let's look at a wonky one, shadow stats, shadowstats.com. This dated-looking website is kind of revered by a number of economists. What shadow stats attempts to do is adjust for what they consider a more real rate of inflation that include things like food and energy costs. And Shadow Stats, whose founder I have talked to on the phone before, his name is John Williams, they often do things like they go back 30 years in time to see how the CPI used to be measured, and often they come up with a higher rate of inflation, like 10%, a substantially higher rate than what is really reported by the government. Shadow Stats is a subscription site, but a lot of people respect his methodology. Many feel it's a fairly wide consensus that the government has a lot of reasons in their CPI and core PCE and PPI to understate the rate of inflation. They don't want to make inflation look too high for a lot of reasons, because consumers would lose faith in the purchasing power of their dollar, because it would be more difficult to pay back our debtors, because our debtors wouldn't want their debt to be denominated in dollars if they thought that it was losing purchasing power. And the government also has all these entitlement programs that are tied to the CPI. And with a higher CPI, they would need to do things like more quickly adjust Social Security payouts and so on, because that's tied to the rate of inflation as a cost of living index. So the government has a lot of reasons to understate the real rate of inflation. You know, some less formal measures of inflation are something that doesn't change over time. In the last video, I talked to you about plotting the price of the Big Mac over 40 or 50 years. Back in 1974, a Big Mac used to cost 65 cents. Today it costs $4. Well, there are problems with measuring inflation that way because the Big Mac ingredients and size and other things probably change. Maybe the quality of the ingredients change. One thing one can do is look at a basket of commodities. For example, take something like copper. Copper is an element on the periodic table. Copper 1,000 years ago, 100 years ago, 10 years ago, and today is the same throughout that entire stretch. So you can look at a basket of commodities, as long as those commodities are things that don't change like an element, such as copper. So those are some inflation measures. Our first video in this three-part series was about price inflation. The second in this Inflation Triple Crown series today was about debt debasement. The lesson here is that when you borrow with long-term fixed interest rate debt tied to a cash flowing asset, you can be a beneficiary. All of your interest payments are outsourced to tenants. We had the example of when you have $1 million in debt at a 4% inflation rate, you benefit from a $40,000 tailwind every year that you may not have even realized it. Even if you own your own home and it doesn't produce income, your debt is being debased in the same way that it is with this second of three crowns in the Inflation Triple Crown, debt debasement. In the next video, we'll look at the third of three crowns in the Inflation Triple Crown. It's actually the most important one. It's what benefits you the most. Also, we're going to talk about, is there a case for deflation out there? If you want to be sure that video gets delivered to you, hit subscribe. And I learned then you also have to hit the notification bell along with the subscribe. And that way we'll have the conclusion to the Inflation Triple Crown, how savvy real estate investors benefit that most people aren't aware of. My name's Keith Weinhold. This is Get Rich Education. Thanks for being here. But as always, you weren't here for me. You were here for you.